The wind howled across the open plains, carrying the scent of rain and the sound of distant thunder. The mountains stood dark in the distance, and the sky was a heavy shade of gray. Inside a small wooden cabin, a single lantern flickered, casting a soft glow over a man sitting silently by the fire. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and rough from years of hard work under the sun. His name was Luke, and people in town called him the Giant Rancher. But behind those strong hands and quiet eyes was a man who had stopped believing that life had anything left to give him. He rarely went to town anymore. He didn't care for gossip or company. The ranch kept him busy enough, the cattle, the fences, the endless chores that filled each lonely day. When the sun went down, he would sit by the fire, listening to the crackle of the wood, thinking about the things he never said out loud. The cabin was neat but cold, like a place built for survival, not for comfort. There were no pictures, no laughter, no soft voices, just the sound of wind pressing against the old walls and the ticking of an old clock above the door. That night the storm came faster than he expected. The first drops of rain hit the roof like stones. The wind grew stronger, making the door rattle. Luke stood, checking the latch and glancing toward the window. The fields outside were vanishing under sheets of rain, and lightning flashed in the distance, cutting through the dark like a warning. He poured himself a cup of coffee, sat down again, and tried to ignore the emptiness that always crept in when the nights turned cold. Then, just as he leaned back in his chair, he heard it, a faint sound carried through the storm. It was so soft at first that he thought he imagined it, but then it came again. A knock, weak, uneven, and desperate. He froze, listening closely. Nobody ever came this far out, especially not on a night like this. The knocking came again, louder this time. His brow tightened as he stood and reached for the lantern. The storm roared outside, and when he opened the door, the wind rushed in, along with the sight that would change his life forever. The rain poured down in heavy sheets, turning the dirt path outside into thick mud. Luke held the lantern high, the golden light flickering against the storm. At first, he saw nothing but rain and shadows. Then out of the darkness, a small figure appeared. It was a little girl, drenched from head to toe, her hair plastered to her forehead. She couldn't have been more than 6 or 7. Her lips were trembling, and in her arms she clutched a small, worn-out doll that looked as soaked as she was. Her eyes, wide and desperate, locked on his. For a moment Luke just stood there, stunned. He'd seen strays, travelers, and even lost ranch hands before, but never a child, alone, in a storm like this. He lowered the lantern slightly and stepped forward. "What are you doing out here, kid?" he asked, his voice deep but gentle. The girl opened her mouth, but her voice came out as a shaky whisper, almost lost under the rain. "Please, mister, can my mother give birth in your cabin?" Luke froze. He wasn't sure he heard her right. "What did you say?" The girl swallowed hard, her tiny body trembling from the cold. "My mama, she's real sick. She can't walk no more, the baby's common, please help her." Her voice broke halfway through the sentence. Luke's heart lurched. Without another word, he stepped off the porch, boots sinking into the mud. The rain was cold and relentless, soaking through his coat as he lifted the lantern higher to see. "Where is she?" he asked. The girl pointed toward the road, her hands shaking. "She's down there by the big tree. I couldn't carry her no more." He didn't hesitate. "Stay close," he said, and started forward. The girl ran beside him, clutching her doll tight. The wind howled around them, pushing hard, but Luke's strides were steady. He was a big man, built like the land itself, tough, grounded, unyielding. Still, what he found beneath the tree nearly stopped his heart. A woman lay there, half covered by a thin blanket, her face pale and drawn. She looked young, too young to be dying, but her breathing was shallow, and her hands pressed weakly against her swollen belly. The rain hit her face, and she didn't even flinch. Her lips were moving, but no sound came out. Luke knelt beside her, setting the lantern down in the mud. "Ma'am," he said, trying to sound calm though his pulse was racing, "can you hear me?" Her eyes fluttered open for a brief second. "The baby, it's time," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He nodded, his jaw tightening. All right, don't you worry now. We'll get you out of this rain. He slid his arms under her carefully. She was so light it startled him, more like lifting a bundle of twigs than a full-grown woman. The girl tried to help, her small hands gripping her mother's dress, but Luke shook his head. I've got her, sweetheart. Stay close. They trudged back through the mud, the storm slapping at their faces. Each step felt endless, but finally, the warm light of the cabin came into view. Inside, Luke kicked the door shut with his boot and laid the woman gently on his bed near the fire. The girl hurried in behind him, dripping and gasping for breath. He threw more wood into the flames, the room filling with a soft, orange glow. The woman's face looked ghostly in the firelight. Luke grabbed a towel and wiped the rain from her skin, then pulled an old blanket over her. She winced, breathing sharply, and whispered something he couldn't make out. "It's all right," he said quietly. "You're safe now." The girl was kneeling beside her mother, holding her hand. "Mama, we're inside. You're gonna be okay. The nice man's helping us." Luke met the child's eyes and something in him shifted. There was no time for fear or doubt, only action. He fetched a pot of water, set it to boil over the fire, and rummaged through his cabinet for clean rags. He had no idea what he was doing, but he wasn't about to let them suffer alone. The woman groaned, her hand tightening on the blanket. "It's common. I can't stop it." Luke felt his chest tighten. He'd helped deliver calves before, but this was different. "All right," he said softly, forcing his hands to stay steady. "You just breathe, ma'am. I'll do what I can." Hours passed in a blur of storm sounds, whispered prayers, and the girl's quiet sobs. The cabin, once silent and lonely, now pulsed with life and fear and desperation. Every time the wind rattled the windows, the girl would flinch. Luke kept his focus on the mother, doing his best to comfort her. He wiped her forehead, whispered steady words, and when the pain grew too much, he let her squeeze his hand until his knuckles turned white. The little girl never left her mother's side. She kept whispering, "It's okay, Mama, I'm here. You're not alone." Each time she spoke, her voice cracked a little more, until finally she fell quiet, her eyes locked on Luke as if trusting him with everything she had left in the world. The storm outside roared louder, but inside something sacred was happening. Life and death stood side by side in that small room. The woman's breathing grew faster, sharper, then weaker. Luke's heart pounded as he did what little he could. He wasn't a doctor, just a rancher with rough hands and a good heart. But somehow, through the chaos and the pain, he heard it, the soft, sharp cry of a newborn baby. For a second, everything stopped. The rain, the thunder, even the fire seemed to quiet down as that single cry filled the cabin. The girl gasped, her small face lighting up through the tears. "Mama, it's the baby. You did it," she whispered. Luke lifted the tiny bundle into his arms, wrapping it in a blanket. The baby's cries were weak but real, a fragile sound of life in a world that had gone dark. He handed the baby to the girl carefully. "Keep him close," he said, his voice low. When he turned back to the mother, his chest ached. She was breathing but barely. Her eyes were half open, glassy, her lips forming silent words. He leaned closer and she managed a faint smile. "Thank you," she whispered. Luke wanted to tell her to rest, that she'd be fine, but the words stuck in his throat. The storm raged on outside, but inside the cabin there was only the sound of the fire crackling, and the faint, steady heartbeat of a new life just beginning. The fire had burned low, leaving only a few glowing embers when the crying stopped. The air inside the cabin was thick with the smell of smoke, rain, and something far more fragile, silence. Luke knelt beside the bed, his breath unsteady, his hands still trembling from the rush of what had just happened. The little girl sat near her mother, holding the baby wrapped in one of Luke's old shirts. Her small arms shook under the weight, not because the baby was heavy, but because she was trying so hard to be strong. Luke looked at the woman's face. Her breathing had gone shallow, her skin pale and still damp with sweat. He had seen life fade before out on the ranch in the animals he couldn't save, but this was different. There was something sacred and unbearable about it. He leaned closer, speaking softly. "Ma'am, you made it through. The baby's fine. You hear me. You did good." Her eyes fluttered open. For a moment she looked straight at him, and in that glance he saw gratitude and something like peace. "Promise me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Promise you'll take care of them." Luke's throat tightened. "Don't talk like that," he said quickly, shaking his head. "You just need rest. I'll ride for the doctor in the morning." But she didn't seem to hear him. Her gaze shifted toward her daughter and the newborn, a soft smile breaking through the exhaustion. "My babies," she murmured, the words catching in her breath. "Please." And then she went still. The only sound left was the wind pressing against the window. The girl didn't speak at first. She just sat there staring at her mother as if waiting for her to move. When nothing happened, she looked up at Luke, her eyes wide and glistening. "She's sleeping, right?" she asked in a small, uncertain voice. Luke couldn't answer. He stood there frozen, his heart pounding so hard he could barely hear himself think. The girl asked again, quieter this time. "She's just sleeping." He swallowed hard and knelt down in front of her. His voice was rough when he finally spoke. "No, sweetheart," he said softly, "she's gone." The little girl's lips trembled. She clutched the baby tighter against her chest, shaking her head. "No, she can't be. She said she'd stay with us." She said, her voice cracked and she broke down, sobbing into the baby's blanket. Luke felt something deep inside him break too. He'd spent years keeping the world at arm's length, never letting anything close enough to hurt. But watching that child cry beside her mother's still body, something inside him stirred that he didn't recognize anymore, a fierce, aching need to protect. He reached out, his rough hand resting gently on the girl's shoulder. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I'm so sorry." She didn't answer. The fire popped and the wind outside howled like a living thing. Luke stood and turned away for a moment, wiping at his face with the back of his hand. He hadn't cried in years, not since the day he buried his own wife under the same kind of stormy sky. He remembered the sound of the rain hitting her coffin lid, the cold silence that followed, and how he swore he'd never care that deeply again. But life, it seemed, had found a way to remind him that promises like that don't hold forever. He covered the woman gently with a blanket, tucking it under her chin as if she might still feel the cold. The girl watched him with big, wet eyes. "What will we do now?" she asked, her voice trembling. Luke took a long breath. "We'll take care of your mama in the morning," he said softly. "And tonight you rest. Both of you." The little girl shook her head stubbornly. "I can't sleep. She'll be scared if I do." He crouched down again, looking her in the eye. "Your mama's not scared anymore. She's watching over you now and that baby too. But she'd want you to rest, you understand." The child sniffed, wiping her face with the back of her hand. She looked down at her brother, then back at Luke. "You'll help us?" Luke nodded slowly. "Yes, ma'am. I'll help you." That seemed to calm her, at least for a moment. He helped her lie down near the fire, spreading an old quilt over her and the baby. She curled up beside her brother, holding him close, her small body still shaking with quiet sobs. Luke sat in the chair nearby, watching over them. Hours passed. The storm outside began to fade, replaced by the soft hiss of rain against the roof. The firelight flickered over the walls, casting long shadows that swayed like ghosts. Luke's eyes grew heavy, but he didn't sleep. Every few minutes he'd glance toward the bed where the mother lay, then back to the two children resting near the fire. By dawn, the rain had stopped. The world outside was silent, washed clean by the storm. Luke stood and stepped outside for a moment, breathing in the cold morning air. The mountains were draped in mist, and the grass shimmered with droplets. He looked toward the old oak tree on the hill behind his cabin, its branches swaying gently. That's where he would bury her, he decided, somewhere peaceful, where the sun could touch the ground and the wind could sing through the leaves. When he went back inside, the girl was awake, sitting up with the baby in her lap. Her eyes were red, but there was a kind of quiet strength in her expression now. She looked at him and said softly, "Mama liked trees. She said they talked to God." Luke nodded, his throat tight. "Then that's where we'll take her," he said. The girl nodded too, then looked down at the baby. "She wanted to name him Samuel," she whispered. "After my papa." Luke felt his heart twist again. "That's a good name," he said quietly. "Strong name." The girl smiled faintly, brushing a bit of lint off the baby's blanket. "He's all I have now." Luke hesitated, then said, "Not anymore." She looked up, confused. He met her gaze and spoke with quiet certainty. "You've got me now, too." The girl didn't reply at first. She just stared at him, as if trying to decide if she could believe that. Then, slowly, she nodded and looked back down at her brother, rocking him gently as the first light of morning filled the cabin. The fire had burned down to ashes, but for the first time in years, Luke felt something warm stirring in his chest that had nothing to do with the flames. The sky turned a soft gold as the morning stretched over the valley. The rain had stopped, but the ground still glistened, soaked through from the night's storm. Luke stood outside the cabin with a shovel in his hand, staring at the old oak tree on the hill behind his home. The air was quiet, heavy with the kind of stillness that follows loss. He'd buried things before, animals, a friend once, even his wife years ago, but this felt different. This felt personal. The girl stood nearby, holding the baby close to her chest, wrapped in one of Luke's old blankets. She didn't cry anymore. Her face was pale, her eyes red but steady. She just watched as Luke worked, her small frame almost lost against the backdrop of the wide, open land. Every now and then the baby made a small sound, a reminder that life, somehow, continued. Luke's shovel hit the earth again and again, the sound sharp and rhythmic in the quiet air. He paused once, leaning on the handle, wiping the sweat from his brow even though the air was cool. His chest felt heavy, not from the work, but from the weight of what had happened inside that cabin just hours ago. He had opened his door to strangers and before dawn had watched one life end and another begin. When the grave was ready, he went back to the cabin. The mother's body was still lying on the bed, her face calm now, her hair brushed neatly by the little girl earlier that morning. Luke lifted her gently, wrapping her in a clean sheet. The girl followed him out, her bare feet silent on the wet grass. Together they walked up the hill. When they reached the oak tree, Luke laid the woman down in the grave. The girl knelt beside her mother for a long moment. She didn't say much, just pressed her small hand to the sheet and whispered something Luke couldn't quite hear. Then she stood, holding the baby closer. Luke cleared his throat. "You want to say a prayer?" he asked softly. The girl shook her head. "Mama said prayers don't need words. She said God listens to hearts." Luke nodded slowly. "She sounds like a wise woman." The girl looked at him, her eyes glistening. She was. He bowed his head for a moment, not out of habit but out of respect. Then he began to cover the grave, one shovel of dirt at a time. The sound of the earth hitting the sheet was dull and final, and the girl flinched at the first few strikes, then went still again. By the time Luke was done, the sun had risen fully, casting a warm light over the oak tree and the fresh mound of soil beneath it. The girl set a small daisy on top of the grave, one she had plucked from the edge of the yard, and whispered, "I'll make you proud, Mama." Luke's hands tightened around the shovel. He looked down at her and then out across the fields, his throat too tight to speak. Something inside him, long buried under years of silence, started to stir again. Later that morning he fixed breakfast in the cabin, biscuits, eggs, and milk. The girl ate slowly, feeding small pieces of biscuit to her baby brother between bites. Luke watched her from across the table. She was quiet but composed, almost too calm for a child. Her hands were small but steady, her movements careful. "You got a name, sweetheart?" he asked gently. She nodded. "It's Clara." "That's a good name," Luke said. "Your mama said the baby's name is Samuel, right?" Clara nodded again. "Yeah, Mama said he was gonna be strong like Papa." Luke smiled faintly, though the ache in his chest hadn't eased. "He's got a strong start already. You both do." Clara looked up from her plate. "What about you, mister? What's your name?" "Luke," he said simply. She tilted her head. "You live out here all by yourself?" "I do," he replied, taking a sip of coffee. "Or I did." Clara frowned, not understanding. "Did?" Luke met her eyes and gave a small, sad smile. "Well, I guess I don't anymore." Something about that made her smile, the first real smile he'd seen from her since she'd arrived. It was small and fragile, but it was enough to fill the room with warmth. The rest of the day passed slowly. Luke repaired the fence out back while Clara rocked Samuel near the fire. Every now and then he'd glance at them through the window, the little girl humming softly, the baby sleeping soundly in her arms, and something about the sight made his chest ache in a way he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't pain exactly. It was something gentler, something he didn't have a name for yet. That evening, when the sun began to set, Luke lit the lantern and sat down in his chair by the fire. Clara sat across from him, still holding the baby. The crackle of the fire filled the silence between them until she spoke softly. "Mama used to tell stories at night. She said stories make people less lonely." Luke nodded slowly. She was right. "Will you tell one?" she asked, hopeful. He rubbed the back of his neck, caught off guard. "I don't know many stories," Clara smiled faintly. "Then tell something true." Luke thought for a moment, staring into the fire. "All right," he said. "Once, there was a man who thought the world was done with him. He built himself a cabin far away and decided he'd live alone. But one night, a storm brought something to his door he didn't expect. It reminded him that sometimes the world still has plans for you, even when you stop making your own." Clara listened quietly, her eyes soft. "That's not a story," she said finally. "That's you." Luke chuckled lowly, shaking his head. "Maybe so." The firelight danced across the walls, flickering softly. Outside, the air was still, and for the first time in years, Luke didn't feel the weight of silence pressing down on him. The cabin no longer felt empty. There was life again, the soft coo of the baby, the quiet hum of the girl, and the steady warmth of something new beginning to take root. When Clara finally drifted off to sleep, the baby in her arms, Luke looked at them for a long time. He pulled the blanket over her shoulders, making sure the baby was tucked in safely, then sat back down, watching the fire fade. He thought about the promise he made, to take care of them. And though he hadn't known it at the time, he realized now it wasn't just a promise for them. It was a promise for himself too. The days turned into weeks, and the winter air grew colder over the wide plains. Each morning began the same way, the soft cry of the baby, the smell of coffee, and the gentle crackle of the fire that never seemed to go out for long. Luke had always lived by routine, but now his days felt different. There was life inside the cabin again, and every sound carried meaning. The quiet wasn't empty anymore. It was full of soft footsteps, quiet laughter, and the sound of Clara humming to her baby brother as she rocked him by the fire. Luke didn't say much, but he found himself noticing things he never used to. The way Clara would braid her hair the same way her mother had. How she always checked on the baby before she ate, or how she thanked him for supper every night, even when it was just beans and bread. The girl had a sense of care beyond her years, and though she tried to be brave, he could still see the shadow of loss behind her eyes. He started teaching her the ways of the ranch. At first she watched him mend fences and feed the horses, standing on the porch with Samuel in her arms. Then one morning she asked shyly, "Can I help?" He looked at her, surprised, then nodded. "Sure, but you'll need boots first." She grinned, and for the first time it reached her eyes. A few days later he found an old pair in the shed, far too big, but she made them work. Every morning after that she'd follow him out, her small steps quick and determined. He taught her how to fill the water troughs, how to gather eggs, and even how to brush the horses. She'd ask questions about everything, her curiosity endless. "Why do you name the horses?" she asked one day, brushing down a chestnut mare. He smiled faintly. "Makes 'em feel like family. You take care of things better when you name 'em." She tilted her head thoughtfully. "Then maybe we should name the cows too." Luke chuckled, shaking his head. "We'd run out of names before spring." Those simple moments began to stitch something together between them. It wasn't just kindness anymore, it was connection. Luke didn't talk about it, but he felt it growing like roots under the soil. The girl had brought warmth into a place that had been frozen for years. At night, when Samuel cried, Luke would wake to the sound of Clara's soft voice singing a lullaby. He'd sit by the fire, pretending not to listen, but her voice always seemed to calm something inside him too. Sometimes she'd fall asleep in the rocking chair, the baby still in her arms, and he'd quietly take the child and lay him in the small cradle he'd built from spare wood. Then he'd drape a blanket over Clara's shoulders and watch the flames dance for a while, wondering how something so small could change his world so completely. One evening, as the snow began to fall outside, Luke was mending a saddle while Clara played on the floor with Samuel. The baby gurgled, kicking his tiny feet, and Clara laughed softly, her eyes shining in the firelight. "Luke," she said after a while, her tone quiet but serious, "why do you live out here all alone?" He looked up, surprised by the question. He took a long breath before answering. "I wasn't always alone. Used to have a family, my wife Anna. She passed away a long time ago." Clara's face softened. "Was she nice?" "The best," he said simply. She looked down, tracing her finger on the floorboards. "Did it hurt when she went away?" Luke's voice lowered. "Yeah, more than I knew a man could hurt. So I came out here, far from everyone. Thought if I stayed busy enough, I wouldn't have to feel it anymore." Clara was quiet for a long time, then said, "That's kind of like what I thought too. I thought if I didn't cry, maybe I wouldn't miss Mama so much." Luke set down the saddle and looked at her. "How's that working out for you?" She gave a small, sad smile. "It doesn't." He nodded slowly. "No, it don't." The room went still except for the soft pop of the fire. Then, without a word, Clara climbed into the old chair beside him, leaned her head on his arm, and whispered, "I'm glad we found you, Luke." He swallowed hard, his chest tightening with something he hadn't felt in years, belonging. He reached over and placed a rough, gentle hand on her shoulder. "I'm glad you did too, sweetheart." As winter deepened, they settled into their new life. Luke took to calling Samuel Little Buck, a nickname that made Clara giggle. She told him stories about her mother, how she loved wildflowers, how she sang while cooking, how she always said kindness costs nothing. Luke listened quietly, holding onto every word like they were pieces of the woman who had trusted him with her children. One morning, Clara came running into the barn with Samuel bundled in her arms, laughing breathlessly. "It's snowing again," she said, her cheeks pink from the cold. Luke smiled and followed her outside. The world was white and still, the air crisp and full of that quiet magic that comes only after snowfall. Clara twirled in the open space, holding the baby close, giggling as snowflakes landed on her hair. Luke watched, his breath forming small clouds in the cold air. For a moment, it felt like something sacred, like the earth itself was giving them a fresh start. When they went back inside, Luke made them cocoa from the little he had left. Clara took a sip and said with a grin, "You make the best cocoa in the world." He laughed, shaking his head. "That's because you've never had anyone else's," she shrugged. "Then I don't need to." That night, after the baby was asleep, Clara sat by the fire, staring into the flames. "Mama used to say love makes a house feel warm," she whispered. Luke glanced at her, then at the firelight dancing across the walls. "She was right," he said softly. The wind picked up outside, rattling the windows, but inside the cabin, everything felt still. Luke realized then that the warmth he felt wasn't from the fire, it was from them. The little girl with the brave heart, the baby with his mother's eyes, and the quiet presence of something he hadn't dared believe in again. It wasn't just comfort or duty anymore. It was family, in the truest, simplest way. He leaned back in his chair, watching Clara's eyelids grow heavy. The baby stirred once, then sighed softly. Luke smiled faintly, his heart steady and full. For the first time in years, the giant rancher wasn't a man alone in the wilderness. The storm that had brought them to his door had also brought him back to life. One heartbeat, one whispered laugh, one quiet night at a time. The snow stayed on the ground for weeks, soft and clean, blanketing the hills in white. The air was sharp in the mornings, and smoke rose from the cabin chimney like a promise that warmth waited inside. Luke had grown used to the sound of Clara's laughter mixing with the crackle of the fire and the soft cooing of baby Samuel. Life had found rhythm again. Simple, quiet, steady. He never said it out loud, but every morning when he opened the door and saw them there, the little girl wrapping the baby in a blanket while humming some tune her mother must have taught her, He thanked heaven that storm had brought them to his door. The days stretched out like threads of peace. Luke worked the land as he always had, but now there was always someone waiting for him when he came back. Clara would run to the porch, her braids swinging, shouting, "Luke's home!" Samuel would reach his tiny hands toward him, his little laugh filling the air. Luke would scoop him up, shaking his head in mock gruffness, saying, "You're getting heavier every day, little buck." But his eyes always softened when he said it. Sometimes, late in the afternoons, he'd take Clara riding out across the open fields. The snow glittered under the sun, and she'd laugh as the horse trotted through it, her cheeks pink from the cold. She looked free then, like a child who had finally found safety. Luke would ride behind her, always keeping close, always watching. When they reached the ridge that overlooked the valley, they'd stop and just sit there quietly for a while. One afternoon, Clara turned in the saddle to look at him. "Do you think Mama can see us?" she asked, her voice gentle, hopeful. Luke didn't answer right away. He looked at the sky, at the soft white clouds drifting slowly above the mountains. "I think she can," he said finally. "And I think she's proud of you." Clara smiled, her eyes shining. "She used to say that the sky is where love goes when people can't hold it anymore. Maybe she sent some down for us." Luke's chest tightened and he nodded. "Maybe she did, sweetheart." That night after supper, he sat by the fire, carving a small piece of wood with his knife. Clara watched from the table, her chin resting on her hand. "What are you making?" she asked. He didn't look up. "You'll see." When he finished, he handed it to her, a small wooden figure of a woman holding a baby. The carving was rough but gentle, the shape unmistakable. Clara stared at it for a long moment, her eyes filling with tears. She held it to her chest and whispered, "Thank you, Luke." He cleared his throat, pretending to look away. "It's not much," he said quietly. "It's everything," she whispered back. The winter began to fade slowly, the snow melting into muddy puddles that shimmered under the early spring sun. The air grew softer, the days longer. Luke planted again, fixing up fences and preparing the land for the new season. Clara followed him wherever he went, Samuel strapped to her back in a blanket sling. She'd hand him tools, feed the chickens, and sometimes stop just to watch the sunrise over the ridge. One morning, while Luke was repairing the barn door, Clara came running toward him, laughing breathlessly. "Luke, Samuel's standing," she shouted. He turned, eyes wide. "What's that?" She grabbed his hand and pulled him toward the cabin. Inside, the baby was holding onto a chair, wobbly but grinning, his tiny fingers gripping the wood for balance. Clara knelt beside him, clapping softly. "See, he's doing it," Luke laughed, a deep, full sound that filled the room. "Well, I'll be. Look at you, little buck." He crouched down, resting a hand on Samuel's back to steady him. The baby looked up, smiling, and in that moment, something in Luke's heart cracked open even wider. He realized he had been waiting for this, not the moment itself, but the feeling of it. The feeling of family, of belonging, of life continuing right in front of him. That night after the baby fell asleep, Luke sat on the porch, staring up at the stars. Clara came out quietly, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. "You always sit out here," she said softly. "Why?" He smiled faintly. "Because it's quiet, and because I like to think the people I've lost are listening." Clara sat beside him. "Then Mama's listening too," he nodded. "Yeah, I reckon she is." They sat in silence for a long time, the night calm around them. The wind moved gently through the grass, and the moonlight washed the land in silver. Clara leaned her head against his arm and said, "I think you were meant to find us, Luke." He looked down at her, his voice low and rough. "Maybe you found me, Clara." Her lips curved into a sleepy smile. "Mama said love always finds its way home." He didn't answer, but he didn't need to. The truth of it sat heavy and real in his chest. The next few weeks passed quietly. Samuel began to crawl, his laughter echoing through the cabin. Clara learned to bake bread, though the first few loaves came out hard enough to break a tooth, and Luke pretended to love every bite. They started to fill the house with little things that made it theirs. Clara's drawings pinned to the wall, Samuel's blanket always hanging near the fire, A wildflower Clara had pressed between the pages of an old Bible Luke hadn't opened in years. One morning, Luke woke early and stepped outside to find Clara already up, standing under the oak tree. She was humming softly, holding a small bunch of fresh flowers in her hand. He walked over quietly. "Visiting your mama?" he asked. She nodded. "I told her we're doing okay, that you take good care of us." Luke's voice was soft when he said, "I reckon she knows that already." Clara smiled faintly and tucked the flowers into the grass at the base of the tree. Then she turned to him, eyes bright. "I think she's happy now." He reached out and gently brushed a loose strand of hair from her face. "I think we all are." The sun was just starting to rise, spreading light over the valley. The air smelled like pine and wet earth. The cabin behind them stood quiet and steady, smoke curling from the chimney. Inside, Samuel's soft cry broke the morning stillness. Clara looked toward the sound, then back at Luke. "He's awake," she said. Luke smiled, a slow, deep smile that reached his eyes. "Go on, little mama. He's calling for you." As she ran back toward the cabin, the light grew brighter, touching the oak leaves, the hills, and the roof of the home that had once belonged to a lonely rancher. Luke stood there for a while, listening to the sound of laughter spilling through the door, and the wind moving through the trees like a whisper of thanks from a woman he never really knew, but who had somehow given him everything he'd lost and more.